Welcome. You've found your way to this quiet space, a moment set apart from the hurry of the day. Let yourself settle now. Let your breathing slow, your thoughts soften, your body ease into stillness. Tonight, we'll move gently northward, across cold seas and into a world of long winters. We'll walk through the doors of Viking longhouses, built from timber and turf, standing against months of darkness and cold. These structures sustained families through seasons when the fire burned low, when snow piled high against the walls, and when daylight barely touched the horizon. Over the hours ahead, we'll see how these buildings were constructed, how warmth was retained inside them, how people organised their lives around the hearth, and how they found rest when the world outside turned frozen and still. We'll move slowly through their winter, watching the season unfold as they lived it. Preparation, depth, waiting, and the gradual return of light. So breathe deeply, let yourself relax into this journey, and let the story of winter in the Viking North begin. The Shortening Days. Across the lands where Vikings lived, autumn arrived with a familiar rhythm. In Norway, along the coasts and fjords, the sun began its slow retreat. In Iceland, where settlements clung to sheltered valleys, the light grew thinner each day. In Greenland, at the edge of the known world, darkness came even sooner, swallowing the land for months at a time. The change was gradual at first, days shortened by minutes, then by hours. The sun traced lower arcs across the sky, never climbing as high as it had in summer. Mornings stayed dimmer longer. Evenings arrived earlier. The air grew colder, sharp against the skin, carrying the scent of snow. For the people who lived in these northern places, the retreat of daylight was not a surprise. It came every year, as certain as the seasons. They knew what it meant. They knew what would follow. The shortening days were a signal, a quiet warning that preparation must begin. In coastal Norway, where winters were milder but still harsh, families watched the light fade and made their plans. They counted the weeks until darkness would dominate their days, until outdoor work would become difficult and dangerous. They calculated how much food they would need, how much fuel must be gathered, and how many repairs must be finished before the cold locked them indoors. In Iceland, where wood was scarce and the winters more severe, the shortening days carried greater urgency. Communities had less margin for error. Every task left undone in autumn could become a threat in winter. The sun's retreat set a deadline for all the work that sustained life through the frozen months. In Greenland, at the northern edge of Viking settlement, the sun disappeared entirely for weeks at a time. There, families lived with near total darkness from November through January. The shortening days marked the beginning of a long twilight, a blue-grey luminescence that would replace the sun for much of the winter. The Vikings did not fight this change. They did not resist the coming darkness or curse the cold. They had lived through it before many times. Their ancestors had survived it for generations. They knew the rhythms of the northern year, and they moved with them. As the days shortened, work intensified. Fields were harvested, animals were brought in from pasture, roofs were inspected and repaired, walls were reinforced, turf was cut and stacked, peat was gathered, wood was collected wherever it could be found. Every hand worked, every day, until the preparations were complete. The shortening days also changed the rhythm of daily life. Families rose earlier to make use of the light. They worked longer hours, pushing themselves to finish tasks before darkness made them impossible. Meals shifted to accommodate the changing light. Sleep patterns adjusted as bodies responded to the lengthening nights. Children learned to read the signs of the season. They saw how adults measured the sun's position, how they watched the sky for weather patterns, how they calculated the time remaining before winter's full arrival. These observations taught them the knowledge they would need as adults, when they would make the same calculations and preparations. The psychological shift was as important as the physical preparation. Families knew that winter meant confinement, isolation, and long stretches of darkness. They prepared their minds as well as their homes, accepting the stillness that would come, making peace with the limits the season would impose. In these northern lands, where summer brought endless light and winter brought endless darkness, the people lived according to extremes. They learned to work intensely when conditions allowed, and to rest deeply when conditions demanded it. The shortening days mark the transition between these two states, the passage from activity to stillness. As autumn advanced, the sun continued its retreat. The days grew shorter. The nights grew longer, the cold deepened, and all across the Viking north, families watched and waited, knowing that soon the darkness would arrive in full and they would enter the long winter that tested their preparations and their resolve. Harvest and preparation. The work of preparing for winter began months before the first snow fell. In the Viking north, survival depended on the labour done in summer and autumn, when daylight lasted long and the land yielded its resources. Families worked from early morning until late evening, gathering everything they would need to endure the months when the world turned cold and still. Grain harvests came first. Barley and rye, the staples of the Viking diet, had to be cut, dried and stored before frost could damage them. Fields that had been tended through spring and summer were now emptied, the grain bundled and carried to storage buildings where it would remain dry through the winter. Each sheaf represented calories that would sustain life when no new food could be grown. Hay was cut in vast quantities for the animals that would share the winter with their human keepers. Cattle, sheep and goats needed fodder to survive the months when no grass grew. The hay was dried in the sun, turned repeatedly to prevent rot, then stacked in shelters or under cover where snow and rain could not reach it. The quality and quantity of the hay harvest determined which animals would survive and which would have to be slaughtered before winter. Fishing intensified in autumn. Cod, herring and other fish were caught in great numbers, then preserved through drying or salting. Fish hung from racks in the open air, the cold wind and low humidity turning them hard and shelf-stable. Some fish were packed in salt, a precious commodity that had to be used carefully. Others were buried in pits where the cold earth kept them frozen through the winter months. Meat preservation required similar attention. Animals slaughtered in autumn provided fresh meat that had to be processed quickly. Some was eaten immediately. The rest was cut into strips and dried, or salted and stored, or frozen in outdoor caches where the cold served as a natural preservative. Nothing was wasted. Organs, blood, bones, every part of each animal was used or preserved in some way. Wild resources supplemented what could be farmed or herded. Berries were gathered and dried. Mushrooms were collected and preserved. Nuts were stored. Seabirds were caught and their meat preserved. Seals were hunted for their meat, blubber, and the skins. Each of these resources added to the stores that would carry families through winter. Fuel collection was equally important. In Norway, where forests provided timber, wood was cut and stacked in quantities that would last months. Birch and pine were preferred for their steady burn and good heat output. Their wood had to be cut to size, split, and allowed to dry before it could be stored near the Longhouse, where it would be accessible through winter. In Iceland and to Greenland, where trees were scarce or absent, other fuels had to be gathered. Peat, cut from bogs in thick slabs, provided a slow-burning alternative to wood. It produced less heat but could be harvested in large quantities where it was available. Dried animal dung gathered and stored served as another fuel source, especially in areas where both wood and peat were difficult to obtain. Textile work filled the days of women and children. Wool from sheep had to be cleaned, carded, spun into thread and woven into cloth. The thick wool fabric called wadmal was essential for clothing and blankets. It took hours of labour to produce even a small amount of finished cloth, so the work continued through autumn and into winter, whenever hands were free for spinning and weaving. Furs and hides required processing before they could be used. Animal skins had to be cleaned of flesh and fat, stretched and dried, then softened through repeated working. Some were tanned using bark or other materials. The best furs from bears, wolves or seals were reserved for the warmest clothing and bedding. Lesser furs and hides served other purposes, from floor coverings to door flaps to storage containers. Building repairs could not be postponed. Turf roofs had to be inspected and patched where they had deteriorated. Gaps in the walls needed filling. Doors and shutters require maintenance. The Longhouse itself had to be sound before winter arrived, because repairs would become difficult or impossible once snow covered the ground and temperatures dropped below freezing. Tools were sharpened and mended. Knives, axes, and other implements had to be in good working order. Broken items were repaired. New tools were made if the materials and time allowed. Winter would bring its own tasks, and those tasks would require functional equipment. The organisation of stored goods took considerable thought. Food, fuel, and supplies had to be arranged so they could be accessed easily through the winter. Items used most frequently needed to be closest at hand. Things needed only occasionally could be stored further away. The arrangement had to account for the fact that snow might block some storage areas. and darkness would make finding things more difficult. All of this work happened under the pressure of the shortening days. Every task competed for time and attention. Families made constant calculations about what must be done immediately and what could wait. They balanced the needs of today against the needs of tomorrow, always aware that winter was approaching and the window for preparation was closing. The work was exhausting. Long days of physical labour tested endurance and will, but it was also communal. Families worked together. Neighbours helped each other with large tasks. Children learned by participating. The shared effort created bonds that would matter later, when winter confined people to their homes and social connections became more difficult to maintain. As autumn advanced and the preparations neared completion, families took stock of what they had accomplished. They counted their stores of food and fuel, they assessed the condition of their buildings and equipment, they judged whether their preparations would be sufficient for the winter ahead. And then, when the work was done and the first snows began to fall, they retreated indoors. The season of intense outdoor activity gave way to the season of indoor stillness. The harvest and preparation were complete. Now came the long wait, the slow passage of winter, when survival would depend on the work already finished. The Longhouse at rest. The Viking Longhouse was a structure built for one purpose, to hold life through winter. It was not elaborate or decorative. It did not reach toward the sky or spread across great distances. It was a long, narrow building, its dimensions determined by the needs of the family, its sheltered and the materials available. To build it, length varied with the number of people who would live inside. A small longhouse might stretch 15 metres from end to end. A larger one, housing an extended family or a prosperous household with servants and dependents, could extend 40 metres or more. The longest examples reached 75 metres, though these were rare and were built by wealthy families or community leaders. Width was more consistent. Most longhouses measured 5 to 7 metres across. This dimension was not arbitrary. It reflected the length of timber that could be used for roof beams and the structural limits of the building method. Wider buildings would have required supports in the centre, dividing the interior space and complicating the layout. The walls rose from the ground in a gentle curve, bowing outwards slightly before turning back toward the roof peak. This shape gave strength to the structure, helping it resist wind and snow loads. The curve also increased interior volume without requiring more materials or longer roof beams. The framework was timber set into the ground or resting on stone foundations. Posts supported horizontal beams, and these beams carried the weight of the roof. In areas where wood was plentiful, the frame could be substantial, with thick timbers providing strength and stability. Where wood was scarce, builders used smaller pieces, compensating with careful construction and additional bracing. Walls between the timber posts were filled with wattle and daub. Thin branches or strips of wood were woven between vertical posts, creating a lattice. This lattice was then covered with a mixture of clay, dung, and straw, which was pressed into the gaps and smoothed. When dry, the daub hardened into a solid surface that blocked wind and provided some insulation. Against the exterior of these walls, earth was often piled. Banks of soil, sometimes reinforced with stones, ran along the base of the longhouse, adding thermal mass and further wind protection. These earth banks also helped stabilise the structure, anchoring it against the forces that would test it through winter. The roof was the building's most critical element. It had to shed snow and rain, withstand wind, and provide insulation against cold. The roof structure consisted of rafters running from the wall tops to a central ridge beam. Over these rafters, layers of material created the weatherproof covering. First came birch bark, laid in overlapping strips that directed water downward. Over the bark, turf was placed in thick slabs, cut from meadows where the root systems held the soil together. The turf was laid grass side up, creating a living roof that absorbed moisture and provided excellent insulation. The grass continued to grow for a time, binding the turf slabs together and creating a continuous green covering. Additional layers of earth and sod increased the roof's thickness and insulating value. The total depth of material on a longhouse roof could reach 30 centimetres or more. This created substantial weight, which the timber frame had to support, but it also created a thermal barrier that slowed heat loss and protected the interior from temperature extremes. Inside, the longhouse was organised along its length. The central area running from one end to the other served as the common space where family members gathered, worked, and socialised. Along both sides of this central area, raised platforms served multiple purposes. These platforms, called set or sesha, functioned as benches during the day and sleeping areas at night. The hearth occupied a position near the centre of the building, though not always in the exact middle. It was a shallow pit or a raised stone platform where fires were built for cooking and warmth. The hearth was the heart of the longhouse, the gathering place, the source of light and heat. Smoke from the fire rose toward the roof peak, where it escaped through openings in the gables or through gaps deliberately left in the roof covering. The smoke drifted through the upper portion of the building before finding its way out, depositing soot on the rafters and gradually darkening the interior. Doorways were positioned carefully, often at one or both ends of the building. These openings were necessary for access, but they also represented weak points where cold air could enter. Some longhouses had small entrance porches or vestibules that created an airlock, a space where the cold could be partly contained before someone passed through the inner door into the main living area. Light entered through the doorways and, in some structures, through small openings in the walls. These openings were not glass windows, which were beyond Viking technology, but simple gaps covered with membrane or thin wood that could be opened or closed. They admitted some daylight, but also allowed cold air in, so their use was limited in winter. The interior was dim, even in summer. In winter, when doors remained closed and small windows were sealed, the only light came from the hearth fire and occasionally from oil lamps. The darkness was not complete, but it was constant, a fact of life that people accepted and adapted to. Storage areas occupied spaces at the ends of the longhouse or in alcoves along the walls. Food, fuel and equipment were kept where the rier would remain dry and accessible. Some longhouses had separate storage structures nearby, but essential supplies had to be stored indoors, where cold would not make them difficult to retrieve. Animals sometimes shared the longhouse with people, particularly in harsh climates or when buildings were constructed with integrated byres. A section at one end of the structure might be partitioned off to house cattle, sheep or goats. The animals' body heat contributed to the overall warmth of the building, and keeping them close made winter feeding and care easier. The floor was earth, sometimes covered with straw or rushes for insulation and comfort. In wealthier homes or in areas where stone was available, parts of the floor might be paved with flat stones. The earthen floor provided some thermal mass, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it slowly at night. This was the space where families would live through winter. It was not large, not especially comfortable by modern standards, but it was carefully designed to serve its purpose. Every aspect of its construction, the materials, the dimensions, the orientation, the layout, reflected generations of experience with northern winters. The longhouse at rest, before the cold truly arrived, waited to fulfill its function, to shelter, to contain warmth, and to keep the people inside it alive. First frost, last light. The transition from autumn to winter was not marked by a single event, but by a series of changes that accumulated over days and weeks. The first frost appeared on the grass in the morning. Ice formed at the edges of ponds and streams. The ground hardened. And then one morning the first snow fell, light flakes drifting down from a grey sky, melting when they touched the earth but announcing what was coming. Outdoor work slowed and then stopped. Fields lay empty, their harvest complete. Animals were confined to shelters or brought into the longhouse byre. The boats used for fishing and travel were pulled ashore and secured. Everything that could be damaged by winter weather was protected or brought indoors. The rhythm of daily life changed. Hours that had been spent working in fields or forests were now spent inside, focused on indoor tasks. The urgency of autumn preparation gave way to the patient routine of winter survival. There was still work to be done, but it was different work, quieter and more contained. Light became scarce. In southern Scandinavia, winter days shortened to 4 or 5 hours of dim daylight. The sun rose late and set early, never climbing far above the horizon. The angle of its light, when it appeared, was shallow and weak, offering little warmth. In northern regions, the sun disappeared entirely for weeks at a time. The polar night settled over Iceland's northern coast and Greenland's settlements. There was no sunrise, no sunset, only a prolonged twilight that marked the middle of the day. For hours on either side of this twilight, complete darkness reigned. The absence of light affected more than just visibility. It changed how people fared, how their bodies responded. Sleep patterns shifted, energy levels dropped. The body's internal clock, accustomed to the rhythm of day and night, struggled to adapt to extended darkness. Some people experienced low moods, lethargy, or difficulty concentrating. But Viking communities had lived through this before. They knew the darkness would come and would eventually pass. They organised their lives around it, creating structure and routine that helped them cope. Fixed meal times, regular work schedules, and social gatherings provided the external rhythm that natural light cycles no longer supplied. Temperature continued to drop. The cold was not yet at its worst. That would come later, in the deepest part of winter. But it was constant now, no longer relieved by the warm afternoons or mild spells. The air had a sharp quality, biting at exposed skin. Breath became visible. Metal tools left outside felt painful to touch. Snow accumulated slowly at first. Then with greater frequency, storms arrived, dropping heavy loads of snow that piled against buildings and covered paths. The landscape transformed from brown and grey to white, the snow smoothing contours and muffling sound. The world became quieter, wrapped in a layer of frozen water that absorbed noise and created a strange stillness. Inside the Longhouse, these changes were felt but not fully experienced. The turf roof and thick walls provided insulation from the cold. The hearth fire, now burning more consistently, pushed back the darkness and warmed the air. The interior became a separate environment, distinct from the frozen world outside. Families adapted their clothing for indoor life. The heavy outdoor garments worn for autumn work were set aside. Indoor clothing consisted of layers that could be adjusted as needed. Wool tunics and trousers, often worn over linen undergarments, provided warmth without the bulk required for outdoor survival. Footwear changed too, with lighter shoes or soft leather boots replacing the heavier, weatherproof footwear needed for outdoor work. The hearth fire became the centre of attention. It required constant tending to maintain adequate heat and light. Fuel had to be fed regularly. Ashes had to be cleared to allow proper airflow. The firekeeper, often a woman or older child, monitored the flames and adjusted them as needed, ensuring they provided warmth without consuming fuel wastefully. Social space contracted. Where summer and autumn had allowed people to spread out, to work in different areas, to spend time outdoors, winter forced everyone into the same shared space. The Longhouse interior, which had seemed adequate or even spacious, now held all the life and activity of the household. Privacy became rare. Personal space was limited to one's sleeping bench and the small area immediately around it. This proximity created both comfort and tension. The presence of family members provided companionship and warmth, but it also meant constant awareness of others, constant negotiation of shared space, and constant management of relationships in close quarters. Conflicts that might have been easily avoided in summer required more careful handling in winter. Children adapted to the change. Their play moved indoors, constrained by space and the need to avoid disturbing work activities. They learned to occupy themselves quietly, to find entertainment in small things. They helped with tasks suited to their age and ability, contributing to the household's winter routine while learning the skills they would need as adults. The elderly faced different challenges. The cold affected joints and muscles, making movement more difficult. The darkness affected vision, especially in the dim interior of the Longhouse. But the indoor nature of winter life also brought benefits. The old did not have to labour in fields or forests. They could sit near the fire, staying warm, performing lighter tasks, telling stories and passing on knowledge. The last light of autumn faded into the sustained darkness of winter. The transition was complete. The household had turned inward, focusing its energy on maintaining warmth and sustaining life until spring returned. The work of preparation was done. Now came the work of endurance, the long, slow passage through the cold and dark. Inside the walls, a single longhouse in coastal Norway becomes our window into winter life. The building measured 20 metres from end to end, 6 metres in width. Its turf roof rose in a gentle arc crowned with snow that had fallen the previous night. Smoke drifted from the roof peak, a thin line rising into the grey sky before dissipating in the cold air. Inside lived a family of 12. The household head was a farmer in his middle years, a man whose labour supported the family through fishing, herding, and the management of their modest land. His wife oversaw the indoor work, the textile production, food preparation, and daily maintenance that kept the household functioning. Together they had 6 children, ranging from an infant to a daughter approaching adulthood. The household also included 3 others. An elderly woman, the farmer's mother, held a position of respect and authority despite her age. A nephew orphaned years earlier had been taken in and now worked alongside the farmer. A servant, a young man who had entered service to repay a family debt, completed the household. The interior layout reflected both hierarchy and practicality. The central area, wide enough for people to move and work, ran the length of the building. The hearth sat slightly off-centre, a raised platform of stones where the fire burned. Around the hearth, people gathered for meals, work, and evening conversation. The sleeping benches lined both walls. These raised platforms, built from timber and covered with wooden planks, stood about half a metre above the earthen floor. The height served a purpose. Cold air settled low, so raising the sleeping surface kept people in slightly warmer air. The benches also provided storage beneath, where items could be kept out of the way but still accessible. Position along these benches determined status and comfort. The farmer and his wife occupied the section nearest the hearth on the north wall. This was the warmest position, the most protected from drafts, the most comfortable. Their youngest children slept beside them, sharing the warmth and security of their parents' presence. The older children had positions further along the bench, still relatively close to the fire, but not in the prime locations. The eldest daughter, preparing for her own future household, had her sleeping area near her mother's, learning by proximity the skills she would need. The nephew occupied a section on the opposite wall, closer to the hearth than the children, but not as close as the household head. His position acknowledged his value to the household while maintaining the distinction between the farmer's immediate family and extended members. The servants slept furthest from the fire, in the section nearest the door where cold air entered whenever the door opened. This was the least desirable sleeping position, cold and draughty, but it reflected his status in the household. He accepted this placement as part of his service, knowing it was temporary. The elderly woman had a special position. Despite her age and the respect owed to her, she did not occupy the prime spot nearest the hearth. That belonged to the active household head. But she had a good position on the same side as her son and his wife, close enough to the fire to stay comfortable, with younger family members nearby to assist if she needed help during the night. At the far end of the longhouse, separated by a partition wall, the animals lived. 3 cattle, 6 sheep, and 2 goats occupied this section. Their body heat contributed to the overall warmth of the building. Their presence also meant they could be tended without going outside, important during storms or the coldest days of winter. The byre section had its own small door to the outside, allowing the animals to be led out during milder weather for exercise and to remove accumulated waste. But for much of the winter, they remained inside, and the household adapted to living with the sounds and smells of the animals. Storage occupied corners and alcoves. Sacks of grain stood along one wall, protected from moisture by being raised on wooden pallets. Barrels held preserved fish and meat. Bundles of dried herbs hung from rafters. Fuel, split wood and blocks of peat, was stacked near the door where it could be easily accessed for the fire. Tools and equipment hung on the walls or rested in designated places. Fishing gear occupied one area, agricultural implements another. Cooking vessels and food preparation equipment had their own space near the hearth. Everything had a place, and maintaining this organisation was essential in the confined space. The widow's loom stood against one wall, its frame holding the unfinished cloth she worked on through the winter. Spinning equipment, distaffs, spindles and wool occupied nearby space. These tools represented endless hours of work, the slow transformation of raw wool into finished fabric. The atmosphere inside was thick with smells. Smoke from the fire permeated everything. The wool being worked carried the lanolin scent of sheep. The animals in the byre added their own odours. Food cooking contributed temporary scents that faded after meals. The smell of bodies, of people living in close quarters without bathing facilities, mingled with everything else. Sound filled the space. The fire crackled. Timbers creaked as the building settled. Children talked or played. Adults conversed as they worked. The animals rustled and occasionally vocalized. When strong wind blew outside, it created its own sounds, whistling around the eaves and pressing against the walls. Light came from 3 sources. The hearth fire provided the primary illumination, casting dancing shadows that reached into corners and created a constant play of light and dark. Occasionally, oil lamps supplemented the firelight, small soapstone vessels burning fish oil with moss wicks, though their use was rationed because oil was precious. And in the few hours when any daylight remained, thin light filtered through small openings in the doorway, adding slightly to the interior brightness. This was the space where 12 people would live for the next 4 months, rarely leaving, always together, sharing the warmth and the work and the long, slow passage of winter. The walls contained their world. The hearth sustained their lives. And the carefully arranged sleeping benches, each in its proper place, defined the social order that would carry them through the season. Layers of warmth. The cold outside the Longhouse was constant, sometimes dropping well below freezing for days at a time. Inside, the temperature rarely rose above a few degrees above freezing, even with the fire burning. This was not warm by comfortable standards, but it was survivable, especially when combined with the clothing and bedding that insulated bodies against the chill. Clothing for indoor winter wear consisted of multiple layers, each serving a specific purpose. The innermost layer, worn against the skin, was typically linen when available, or a thin wool shirt. This layer absorbed perspiration and provided a base for the insulating layers above it. Over this came the primary wool garments. A wool tunic reaching to mid-thigh or knee formed the main body covering. The wool was thick, woven in the tight weave called wadmal that trapped air and resisted wind. The tunic had long sleeves and was often worn loose, allowing air to circulate while still providing insulation. Wool trousers or leg wrappings covered the lower body. These could be loose trousers that tucked into footwear, or they could be long strips of wool wound around the legs from ankle to thigh, creating insulated leg coverings that could be adjusted for comfort and warmth. Wealthy families might have tailored trousers, while poorer households made do with simpler leg wrappings. Additional layers could be added as needed. A second tunic, often of a heavier wool, might be worn over the first. A wool cape or blanket could be wrapped around the shoulders. These adjustments allowed people to regulate their warmth as temperatures fluctuated or as their activity levels changed. Footwear indoors was simpler than outdoor. Boots. Soft leather shoes or slippers provided some insulation from the earthen floor, while allowing comfort during long hours of sitting or light movement. In the coldest weather, thick wool socks added additional insulation. Some people went barefoot indoors, relying on the sleeping platforms to keep them off the cold floor. Head coverings were common. A wool cap or hood retained the significant heat that could be lost from the head. Some people wore these constantly indoors. Others removed them near the fire where the air was warmest. The quality and quantity of clothing varied with wealth and status. The household head and his wife wore well-made garments of good wool, possibly decorated with tablet-woven borders. The children wore serviceable but simpler clothing, often handed down from older siblings and repaired as needed. The servant made do with the plainest garments, functional but without refinement. Textile production was ongoing through winter. The women of the household spent hours each day spinning wool into thread, using drop spindles that created fine, strong yarn. The spinning work was portable and could be done while socializing or supervising other activities. The rhythmic motion of the spindle became a constant feature of winter life. Weaving transformed the spun thread into cloth. The upright loom, anchored to the wall, held the warp threads weighted with stones or clay weights. The weaver passed the weft thread through the warp, beating it tight with a weaving sword, creating fabric slowly, row by row. A skilled weaver might produce a few centimetres of cloth in a day. A complete piece of fabric, large enough for a garment, took weeks. The finished cloth required further processing. It was fulled, soaked in water, and beaten to shrink and tighten the weave. This process made the fabric denser and more wind-resistant, improving its insulating properties. The fulled cloth was then dried and sometimes brushed to raise a soft nap on the surface. This wadmal cloth was the foundation of Viking winter survival. It was not waterproof. Wool absorbed moisture, though it retained warmth even when damp. But it was windproof when tightly woven, and it was warm, trapping air in countless other tiny spaces between fibres. The production of enough wadmal to clothe a household required immense labour. Sheep had to be raised and sheared, and their wool processed. The wool had to be cleaned, carded, spun and woven. Each step demanded time and skill. A single garment might represent weeks or months of work spread across the entire year. Furs supplemented wool for those who could obtain them. Bear furs, thick and warm, made excellent bed coverings and could be worn as cloaks. Wolf fur was prized for its insulating quality. Seal fur, for those with access to it, provided excellent warmth and some water resistance. These furs were valuable, often acquired through trade or successful hunting. The treatment of furs required knowledge and care. Hides had to be cleaned and scraped to remove flesh and fat. They were then stretched and dried, a process that prevented them from becoming stiff and unusable. Some furs were tanned with bark or other materials to make them more durable. Others were used as rawhide, flexible when first prepared, but stiffening with age. Bedding followed similar principles of layering. The sleeping benches were hard wooden surfaces that would be uncomfortable and cold without insulation. The first layer was often straw or dried grass, creating a cushioning base that also trapped air. This vegetable layer compressed over time and needed periodic renewal, but it provided essential insulation from the cold wood beneath. Over the straw came animal hides. These might be older furs, past their prime for clothing but still serviceable for bedding. Or they might be treated with leather, less warm than fur but more durable and easier to keep clean. These hides created a barrier between the sleeper and the straw, providing a smoother, more comfortable surface. The primary sleeping covering was wool blankets or more furs. Heavy wool blankets woven from the household's own thread provided warmth without excessive weight. They could be layered as needed, adding or removing blankets as temperature and personal preference demanded. The best furs were reserved for the coldest nights or the most valued members of the household. Some families used feather-stuffed cushions or mattresses, though these were luxuries beyond most households' means. Feathers provided excellent insulation with minimal weight, but they required birds to provide the down, and the time to prepare and sew the ticking that held them. Such items were passed down as valuable possessions. Sleeping in these conditions meant sleeping clothed. People did not undress for bed. They might remove outer layers, but the base clothing remained on, providing insulation through the night. Additional wrappings or cloaks might be added for sleep, creating a personal cocoon of warmth. The layering strategy, in clothing, in bedding, in the building itself, was the key to winter survival. Each layer trapped air, and air was the true insulator. The wood and turf of the building trapped air in countless small spaces. The wool fabric trapped air between its fibres. The furs trapped air in their dense fur. The straw trapped air between its stems. Everything worked together to slow the movement of heat from warm bodies to the cold air, creating a system that kept people alive through months when the outside world was hostile to human life. The hearth's command. The fire at the centre of the Longhouse was more than a source of warmth and light. It was the axis around which winter life revolved. Its flames determined when people rose and when they slept. Its heat drew them near and held them there. Its light defined the space where work could be done and socialization could occur. The hearth commanded, and the household obeyed. The construction of the hearth was simple but carefully designed. Most commonly, it was a raised platform of flat stones, elevated slightly above the floor level. The stones were chosen for their ability to withstand heat without cracking. They were fitted together tightly to create a stable surface for the fire. Some longhouses had a shallow pit dug into the floor, lined with stones, but the raised platform was more common in areas with high groundwater or where the floor was prone to dampness. The size of the hearth varied with the size of the longhouse. A small household might have a hearth measuring 1 square metre. A large household needed a larger hearth to provide adequate heat. The placement within the longhouse was a matter of careful consideration, close enough to the centre to distribute heat evenly, but positioned to account for sleeping areas, workspaces, and the smoke's path to the roof opening. Fuel for the fire came from the stores collected in autumn. Wood was the preferred fuel where it was available. Birch and pine burned well, producing steady heat with manageable smoke. Hardwoods like oak, when available, burned longer and hotter, though they were rarer in the northern regions. The wood was split into pieces of manageable size, allowing it to be fed into the fire as needed. Peat served as fuel in areas where wood was scarce. Cut from bogs in thick slabs and dried through summer and autumn, peat burned slowly and steadily. It produced less heat than wood per unit of volume, but it was abundant where it could be harvested. The smoke from peat had a distinctive smell, earthy and thick, and it coated the interior of the longhouse with a fine dark residue. In Iceland and to Greenland, where both wood and peat were limited, dried animal dung supplemented other fuels. Cow dung, sheep dung, and other animal waste were collected, dried and stored. When burned, they produced moderate heat and considerable smoke, but they were better than no fuel at all. The necessity of using dung as fuel reflected the resource scarcity of the northernmost settlements. Tending the fire was skilled work. Too small a fire left the household cold. Too large a fire consumed fuel wastefully and could create excessive smoke. The firekeeper had to balance these concerns, maintaining a flame that provided adequate warmth and light without depleting the fuel stores prematurely. The morning fire-starting routine began the day. If the fire had been banked overnight, live coals remained under a covering of ash. These coals could be uncovered, fresh fuel added, and the fire brought back to life with gentle blowing or the use of a bellows. If the fire had died completely, it had to be restarted, a more difficult task. Fire starting without matches requires tools and materials. A piece of steel struck against flint or pyrite produced sparks. These sparks fell onto tinder, typically dried fungus, charred cloth, or fine wood shavings. The tinder caught the spark and began to glow. Careful blowing encouraged this glow into a small flame. The flame was then transferred to the kindling, and from kindling to larger fuel. The process required patience and skill. Damp tinder failed to catch. Poor technique extinguished the growing flame. The cold made fingers clumsy and reduced the efficiency of the materials. An experienced firekeeper could restart a fire quickly, but even they faced occasional failures that meant extended cold and darkness. Through the day, the fire burned steadily. Fuel was added regularly, maintaining consistent heat. The flames provided warmth to the family members gathered nearby, their heat radiating outward but diminishing with distance. Those sitting closest to the fire enjoyed the most warmth. Those working further away felt less benefit. The fire was also the cooking fire. Meals were prepared over its flames or in iron pots suspended above it on chains or tripods. Cooking typically occurred once or twice daily, producing substantial meals that would be supplemented with preserved foods eaten cold. The cooking process added moisture to the air, creating steam that rose toward the roof along with the smoke. Food cooked over the fire included porridges made from grain, stews, combining preserved meat with stored vegetables, and fish prepared in various ways. Bread, when made, was cooked on flat stones placed near the fire or on iron griddles. The cooking methods were simple but effective, producing warm, nourishing food that helped maintain body temperature through the day. The fire's light was as important as its heat. The flames illuminated the interior space, creating a zone of visibility around the hearth. Beyond this zone, in the corners and at the ends of the longhouse, darkness gathered. The dancing firelight cast moving shadows that made the space feel alive, constantly shifting and changing. Evening was the fire's peak time. After the evening meal, the family gathered around the hearth. This was the social time when stories were told, conversations held, and decisions made about the next day's activities. The fire provided the focus for these gatherings, its warmth and light drawing people together and creating a sense of community and shared experience. As the evening progressed towards sleep, the fire management changed. The flames were allowed to burn down, reducing fuel consumption for the night hours when less heat and no light were needed. Before sleep, the remaining coals were covered with ash, a process called banking. The ash reduced the oxygen supply to the coals, causing them to burn very slowly, preserving them through the night. Banking the fire was an act of trust and skill. If done properly, live coals would survive until morning, making fire starting easier. If done poorly, the fire would die completely, requiring a full restart in the cold morning. Too much ash smothered the coals entirely. Too little ash allowed the fire to burn away during the night. The overnight survival of the banked coals also represented a small victory over the cold and darkness. The preserved coals were a thread of warmth maintained through the coldest, darkest hours, a connection between one day and the next. A sign that the household maintained its small flame against the vast cold outside. The hearth commanded the household's daily rhythm. It determined wake and sleep times. It influenced where people sat and worked. It provided the warmth and light that made winter survival possible. And it required constant attention, constant feeding, constant care. The fire could not be forgotten or neglected. It demanded respect and labour. In return, it sustained life through the long winter months. The evening descent. As the afternoon faded into evening, the activities inside the Longhouse shifted toward the routines that would prepare the household for sleep. The transition was not abrupt. There was no clock to mark the hour, no sudden change in light to signal bedtime. Instead, the descent into evening followed natural rhythms shaped by the completion of daily tasks and the dimming of the already limited light. The evening meal was the first marker. Preparation began in late afternoon, when the cooking vessels were brought out and filled with food. A pot of porridge might be made from stored grain, thickened with water and cooked slowly over the fire, or a stew might be assembled from preserved meat, dried vegetables, and herbs, simmering for an hour or more to become tender and warm. The family gathered for the meal, sitting on benches near the hearth or on the raised sleeping platforms. Bowls or wooden trenchers held individual portions. Spoons, carved from wood or bone, served for eating. Bread, if available, was torn and shared. Milk or weak ale might accompany the food, poured from ceramic jugs or wooden vessels. The meal was a communal time, conversation flowed, the day's activities were discussed. Plans for tomorrow were mentioned. Children reported on their play or small tasks. The farmer spoke of work that needed attention. The women discussed textile progress. The servant contributed when addressed. The elderly grandmother offered observations or memories. After eating, the vessels were cleaned and set aside. This task often fell to the older children, who carried the items to a designated area where they could be washed with cold water or simply wiped clean for the next use. Food scraps went to the animals in the byre or were saved for later consumption. With the meal completed, the evening's main social period began. This was the time for stories, for the passing of cultural knowledge, for entertainment, and for the strengthening of family bonds. The household gathered around the fire, its flames providing both warmth and the focal point for attention. Stories told during these evening hours varied in content and purpose. Some were historical accounts, tales of ancestors or famous Viking whose deeds had become legendary. These stories reinforced cultural identity and provided examples of behaviour to emulate or avoid. Children listened and learned about their heritage, about the values their society held important. Other stories were educational, teaching practical knowledge through narrative. A story about a hunting expedition might contain detailed information about tracking animals, reading weather signs, or surviving unexpected dangers. A story about a previous winter might include lessons about food storage, fire management, or the importance of preparation. Mythological tales featured gods and supernatural beings, explaining natural phenomena or exploring moral and philosophical questions. These stories entertained while also conveying religious and cultural beliefs. The characters and their actions provided a framework for understanding the world and humanity's place within it. Some evenings brought songs instead of, or in addition to stories. Traditional melodies, passed down through generations, were sung by individuals or the group together. The songs might be about love, loss, courage, or daily life. The music provided emotional expression and artistic satisfaction, breaking the monotony of winter confinement. Riddles and word games engaged minds and created friendly competition. These mental exercises kept intellectual faculties sharp while amusing. Some riddles were simple enough for children, while others challenged even the adults, creating a range of participation that included the entire household. Practical work continued during these evening hours for those not directly engaged in entertainment. The women often continued spinning, their hands working the wool while their attention remained on the conversational stories. The rhythmic motion of the spindle required less than full concentration, allowing the work to proceed simultaneously with social activity. Men might work on small carving projects, creating wooden implements or decorative items. The work was detailed but portable, done by firelight with simple tools, a new spoon, a game piece, a small figurine. These items emerged slowly from blocks of wood over many evenings of patient carving. Maintenance tasks filled some of the time. Clothing was inspected for damage and mended. Tears in fabric were sewn closed. Loose stitches were reinforced. Worn areas were patched. This ongoing maintenance extended the life of garments and ensured they would continue to provide protection against the cold. Tools required similar attention. Knives were sharpened on whetstones, their edges maintained for cutting work. Axe heads were inspected for cracks or looseness. Broken tool handles were repaired or replaced. The work was methodical and necessary, ensuring that equipment remained functional. As the evening deepened, activities gradually wound down. The fire was built up one final time for the night, creating a surge of warmth that would carry into the sleeping hours even after the flames were banked. The household began preparing for sleep. Personal preparations were minimal but important. A trip outside to relieve oneself was necessary, made unpleasant by the cold but unavoidable. The outhouse or designated outdoor area was visited quickly, and the return to the Longhouse's relative warmth was welcomed. Inside, sleeping areas were checked and adjusted. Straw bedding was fluffed or rearranged. Furs and blankets were positioned. Each person settled into their designated space on the sleeping benches, arranging their layers for maximum warmth. The youngest children were settled first, helped by their parents to lie down and covered with blankets. Their presence and warmth were comforting to parents who slept nearby. The older children settled themselves, familiar with the routine and capable of managing their own bedding. The adults settled last, after ensuring everyone else was comfortable, and the Longhouse was secure for the night. The door was checked, ensuring it was closed firmly against the cold. The fire was banked, its coals covered with ash to preserve them through the night. Final quiet conversations occurred in the dimness, voices low to avoid disturbing those already drifting towards sleep. Then silence gradually descended, broken only by the small sounds of people settling, the crackle of the banked fire, and the wind outside the walls. The descent from evening activity to sleep was complete. The household entered the stillness of night. Each person wrapped in layers of wool and fur lying on sleeping benches in the dim interior waiting for sleep to come, darkness and breath. Night in the Longhouse was not silent. The building itself created sounds as it settled, as timbers cooled and contracted, as wind pressed against walls and roof. The fire, banked but not extinguished, occasionally popped or crackled as a coal shifted, and the people inside, breathing and moving in sleep, added their own quiet sounds to the darkness. Breath was constant. 12 people, each drawing air in and releasing it, created a soft rhythm of respiration. The sound was not loud, but in the profound quiet of the winter night it was noticeable. Some people breathed deeply and slowly, others more rapidly. Occasionally someone would sigh or shift position, their breathing pattern changing momentarily before settling back into the regular rhythm of sleep. The cattle in the byre section contributed their own sounds. They breathed more loudly than humans, their larger lungs moving greater volumes of air. They occasionally shuffled or stamped, their hooves scraping against the floor. Sometimes one would low softly, a sound that carried through the partition wall into the main living area. The wind outside made the most persistent sound. It varied from a low whistle to a stronger rushing noise, depending on its intensity. When wind struck the Longhouse, it created pressure that the structure resisted. The turf roof held firm, the walls stood solid, but the sound penetrated, a reminder that beyond the insulated walls the winter night continued its cold vigil. Snow falling on the roof created a softer sound, barely audible but present on the nights when storms arrived. The snow accumulated in layers, adding to the insulation, increasing the roof's weight gradually. Inside, the sound was like a very quiet rustling, more felt than heard, a subtle presence at the edge of awareness. The temperature inside the Longhouse dropped through the night. The banked fire provided some heat, but far less than the active flames of evening. The warmth that had filled the space began to dissipate, seeping through the walls and roof, migrating toward the cold outside. The air was cool, though it did not reach the brutal temperatures beyond the door. Cold air sank toward the floor. The Longhouse interior developed a temperature gradient, warmest near the roof peak, where warm air accumulated, coldest at ground level, where cold air settled. The sleeping platforms, raised above the floor, kept the sleepers in a slightly warmer zone, but they still felt the cold as the night progressed. Some people slept soundly through this cooling. Others, particularly the elderly or those sleeping in less favourable positions, woke occasionally, their bodies reacting to the reduced temperature. They might adjust their coverings, pulling blankets tighter or adding another layer. They might curl more tightly, reducing the surface area exposed to the air. Then they would settle back into sleep. Dreams visited some sleepers. The darkness and quiet created a mental space where the unconscious mind played out its dramas. Dreams might reflect the day's experiences, the coming spring, fears about food stores lasting, or purely fantastical scenarios disconnected from reality. In the morning, some dreams would be remembered and discussed. Others would fade immediately upon waking. The profound darkness affected sleep patterns. Human circadian rhythms evolved in response to natural light cycles, and the extreme darkness of winter disrupted these rhythms. Some people slept longer hours in winter, their bodies responding to the absence of light by producing more melatonin and promoting extended rest. Others struggled with sleep, their internal clocks confused by the lack of normal light cues. Children generally adapted well to the darkness, their young bodies flexible in their sleep patterns. They slept deeply, sometimes for 10 or 12 hours, waking refreshed. The elderly sometimes slept less soundly, waking more frequently, finding it harder to achieve the deep rest that restored energy and health. Moisture from breathing accumulated in the air. 12 people, plus several animals, all exhaling water vapour, gradually increased the humidity inside the longhouse. In the cold air, this moisture could condense on surfaces that reached low temperatures. The upper parts of the walls, farthest from the fire's residual warmth, sometimes developed a thin layer of frost or dampness. Ventilation helped manage this moisture. Small openings in the roof allowed some air exchange, pulling humid air out while allowing drier cold air to enter. The balance was delicate. Too much ventilation and the heat escaped too quickly. Too little and moisture buildup became problematic. The design of the longhouse attempted to maintain this balance automatically, but conditions varied with weather and occupancy. The smell of the longhouse at night was distinct. Smoke from the fire permeated everything. The wool clothing and bedding carried the scent of lanolin. The animals contributed their own odours. Human bodies, unwashed for weeks or months, were added to the mixture. The result was a thick organic smell that would have been overwhelming to someone from outside, but that the residents had long since ceased to notice consciously. Body heat shared between family members sleeping close together created localized warmth. Where parents slept with young children between them, the combined heat of 3 bodies raised the temperature under their shared blankets by several degrees. This shared warmth was pleasant and comforting, both physically and emotionally, creating a sense of security against the cold night. In the coldest positions, near the door, the servant experienced the night differently. His sleeping area received the least benefit from the banked fire. Cold air from the entrance passage crept along the floor and reached his bench. His blankets and furs were of lesser quality than those of the family members. He felt the cold more acutely, and sometimes woke shivering, pulling his coverings tighter and curling into himself for warmth. The grandmother, despite her position near the fire, also felt the cold more than younger family members. Her reduced circulation meant her extremities grew cold easily. She wore extra layers to sleep and had been given additional furs to compensate for her body's reduced heat production. Even so, she sometimes woke and had to flex her fingers and toes to encourage blood flow. The night passed slowly. Hours accumulated in darkness and quiet. The household slept, their breathing continuing its soft rhythm. The animals dozed or chewed cud. The building held them all, its walls and roof creating the separation between the warmth of human life and the cold of the winter world. Outside, the temperature dropped to levels that would freeze exposed flesh in minutes. Snow accumulated on the ground and on the longhouse roof. Stars shone with exceptional clarity in the cold air, their light offering no warmth. The moon, when present, illuminated the landscape in pale light that made shadows stark and cold. When clouds covered the sky, the darkness was complete. But inside the longhouse, life persisted. The banked coals glowed faintly beneath their ash covering. The people slept, and the night continued hour after hour until eventually the time would come to wake, to uncover the coals, to begin another day. But that time had not yet arrived. For now there was only the darkness and the breathing and the patient waiting for morning. Colds creep. Despite all the insulation, all the careful construction, all the layers of turf and wool and fur, the cold found ways to enter. It did not arrive suddenly or dramatically. It crept slowly, persistently, seeping through every small gap, every tiny imperfection, every place where materials met but did not quite seal. The cold was patient and unrelenting, and it never truly left the longhouse, only retreated when the fire burned bright and advanced again when the flames diminished. The door was the most obvious entry point. The wooden door, fitted into its frame as tightly as craftsmanship allowed, still had gaps. When the wind pressed against it, Cold air infiltrated through these spaces. The people felt this as a draft, a subtle movement of air that carried cold from outside to inside. The draft was worse near the door itself and diminished with distance from it, but its presence was constant. The entrance passage helped mitigate this. In longhouses with small porches or vestibules, the cold air entering through the outer door had to pass through this buffer space before reaching the inner door. The two-door system created a simple airlock that reduced the direct flow of cold air into the main living area. But even with this design, cold still entered, just more slowly. Gaps between the wall materials allowed cold infiltration. The wattle and door walls, while effective, had small cracks where the daub had shrunk or failed to bond completely with the wattle. Wind forced cold air through these cracks. The earth banks against the exterior walls blocked some of this infiltration, but they could not eliminate it entirely. The junction between walls and roof was another vulnerable point. The construction method meant that the wall tops had to support the roof beams, creating areas where different materials met. These junctions, despite careful construction, allowed some air passage. Cold air found these paths and followed them inward. The roof ventilation openings, necessary for smoke escape, also admitted cold. The openings were small and positioned to minimise this effect, but they could not be eliminated without creating dangerous smoke build-up inside. The result was a constant small flow of cold air downward from the roof peak, mixing with the warmer air below. Windows where they existed were not glazed with glass. They were simply small openings in the walls, sometimes covered with oiled parchment or thin wood shutters. In winter, these openings were usually kept closed and blocked, but even closed they allowed some cold penetration. The materials used to block them, fabric, hide and or thin wood, had less insulating value than the thick turf walls. The floor was a source of cold that rose from below. The earth beneath the longhouse remained frozen through winter. This frozen ground drew heat from the interior, cooling the floor surface above it. Straw scattered on the floor provided some insulation, but it compressed with foot traffic and lost effectiveness over time. The raised sleeping benches helped people avoid the coldest layer of air that settled at floor level. Temperature gradients within the longhouse created zones of varying cold. Near the hearth, where the fire burned or where coals remained, the air might reach slightly above freezing. Further from the hearth, temperatures dropped. In the corners and at the ends of the building, the air temperature approached the outdoor temperature, only slightly warmed by the distance from outside. The sleeping positions reflected these gradients. The family members nearest the hearth enjoyed the warmest sleeping conditions. Those further away experienced progressively colder nights. The servant, sleeping near the door in the coldest position, sometimes woke to find his breath forming visible clouds in the air, even under his blankets. Moisture complicated the temperature experience. Damp air felt colder than dry air at the same temperature. The moisture from breathing and from the animals accumulated in the air and sometimes condensed on cold surfaces. When this condensation formed on skin or clothing, the evaporative cooling made the cold feel more intense. Body position affected how cold it was experienced. Someone lying flat with their body spread across the sleeping bench exposed more surface area to the air and felt colder. Curling into a ball reduced surface area and helped retain body heat. People sleeping in cold positions unconsciously curl tightly, their bodies responding to the temperature by minimizing heat loss. Layers of bedding created insulation, but they required proper management. Too few layers left the sleeper cold, but layers could shift during sleep, creating gaps where cold air could reach the body. People woke sometimes to find a blanket had slipped off their feet or shoulders, exposing that area to the cold. Adjusting the coverings and returning them to their proper positions restored warmth. Shared sleeping provided significant warming benefits. Children sleeping between parents received warmth from both sides. The parents, while giving up some of their own warmth, received warmth in return from their children and from each other. This mutual warming made the sleeping experience tolerable, even in quite cold conditions. Single sleepers faced greater challenges. The elderly grandmother, despite her relatively good sleeping position, slept alone. She had no one to share body heat with. Her advanced age meant her body produced less heat than younger people's bodies. She compensated by wearing more layers and using more blankets, but she still felt the cold more acutely than family members who slept in pairs or groups. Adaptation to cold was both physical and psychological. Bodies exposed to consistent cold developed some adaptive responses. Blood flow patterns adjusted to protect core temperature at the expense of extremities. Metabolic rates increased slightly to generate more heat. But these adaptations had limits. Prolonged exposure to cold beyond what the body can compensate for leads to hypothermia. Psychologically, people became accustomed to being cold much of the time. The experience of continuous moderate cold became normal. They learned to tolerate discomfort that would have been distressing at the beginning of winter. This mental adaptation was as important as physical adaptation, allowing people to function despite the constant challenge of the cold. The cold also affected the body's response to illness. Colds, coughs, and other respiratory ailments were common in winter. The cold air, the close quarters, the accumulation of moisture, all contributed to the spread of infections. A simple cold that would have been a minor annoyance in summer became more serious in winter when the body was already stressed by cold and reduced nutrition. Children seemed more resilient to the cold than older adults. Their bodies were flexible and adapted quickly. They complained less about the cold, perhaps because they had never known anything else growing up in these conditions. They played and worked despite temperatures that would have immobilized adults raised in warmer climates. The cold's creep was slow but inexorable. From autumn through deep winter, the average temperature inside the Longhouse gradually dropped. The fire provided resistance to this cooling. But fuel limitations meant the fire could not burn continuously at full strength. As winter deepened, the internal temperature settled at a level that balanced the heat input from the fire against the heat loss through all the pathways the cold had found. This equilibrium temperature was typically just above freezing near the hearth and dropped below freezing in the far corners of the building. It was cold enough that water in containers would freeze if left away from the fire. It was cold enough that breath formed visible clouds, but it was not cold enough to be immediately life-threatening for properly clothed and covered people. It was survivable, cold, manageable cold, but it was still cold, a constant presence that never quite went away. Shared warmth. In the coldest hours, when the banked fire provided minimal heat and the cold pressed most insistently against the walls, the shared warmth of the bodies became essential. The practice of sleeping close together, of families clustering on the sleeping benches, was not just a matter of space efficiency or social bonding. It was a thermal strategy, a way of pulling the heat generated by metabolism and using it collectively to maintain survivable temperatures. Each human body generated heat as a byproduct of the metabolic processes that sustained life. At rest, an adult body produced approximately the same amount of heat as a 100-watt light bulb. This heat radiated from the skin surface into the vaisseau surrounding air. In isolation, much of this heat was lost, benefiting no one. But when bodies were close together, the heat from one person warmed the air and surfaces near them, and that warmth was felt by adjacent bodies. The farmer and his wife slept side by side, their sleeping area taking up one section of the bench nearest the hearth. Between them, on most nights, slept one or two of their youngest children. The infant, still nursing, always slept between them, the mother's body providing warmth and access to feeding through the night. The next youngest child, a toddler, also often slept in this cluster, sandwiched between the adults. This arrangement created a thermal unit. The two adults, each producing substantial body heat, created a warm zone. The children, positioned between them, received heat from both sides. Under shared blankets, this heat accumulated, raising the temperature of the air trapped beneath the coverings. The children, who lost heat more rapidly than adults due to their smaller body mass and higher surface area to volume ratio, benefited enormously from this arrangement. The older children slept in their own area of the bench, but they too clustered together. The three middle children, ranging from about 4 to 10 years old, slept in a row, often touching each other as they shifted through the night. Their combined body heat created a warmer microclimate than any one of them could have achieved alone. The eldest daughter, approaching adulthood, had her own sleeping space, but it was positioned next to her mother's. While she slept somewhat apart, maintaining a degree of independence appropriate to her age, she was close enough to benefit from the residual warmth of her parents' sleeping area. Her sleeping space was warmer than it would have been if positioned elsewhere, simply due to its proximity to the primary thermal zone. The nephew occupied his own section on the opposite bench, but his position was relatively close to the fire. He slept alone without the benefit of shared body heat, but his sleeping area's location compensated somewhat for this isolation. The residual heat from the banked coals reached his position more effectively than it reached the ends of the building. The grandmother slept near the family cluster, close enough to be within reach if she needed assistance during the night. Her sleeping area was warm by the standards of the Longhouse, benefiting from its nearness to the hearth and to the main family sleeping cluster. Yet she slept alone, and her elderly body produced less heat than the younger family members. She compensated by using more blankets and sleeping in additional layers of clothing. The servant experienced winter nights differently. His sleeping position at the far end of the building near the door was the coldest in the Longhouse. He slept alone without the benefit of shared body heat. The cold air that infiltrated through the door settled in his area. The heat from the poor banked fire barely reached him. He relied entirely on his blankets and clothing to retain the heat his own body produced, and this was often barely adequate. On the coldest nights, even the servant's standard coverings proved insufficient. He would wake shivering, his body's core temperature dropping toward dangerous levels. On such nights, he might request permission to move closer to the fire, sleeping temporarily on the floor in a warmer location. This was granted when the cold was truly severe, though it represented a deviation from the normal order and was not done lightly. The thermal strategy extended to the manner of sleeping. People did not sprawl out in winter. They slept curled, knees drawn up, arms tucked in, bodies making themselves compact. This position reduced surface area and minimized heat loss. It also allowed people to sleep closer together without interfering with each other's space, as folded bodies took up less room than extended ones. Shared blankets enhanced the warming effect. Where a single blanket might cover one person, leaving edges that admitted cold air, a larger blanket covering multiple people created a more effective thermal envelope. The edges could be tucked under bodies, eliminating drafts. The shared blanket trapped the combined heat of all the bodies beneath it, creating a warmer environment than individual blankets would provide. The material of the blankets mattered. Wool blankets trapped air in the spaces between their fibres. This trapped air warmed from body heat and created insulation. The more layers of wool, the more trapped air, the better the insulation. Wealthy families used multiple heavy wool blankets and furs, creating substantial insulation that held heat effectively. Fur blankets were even more effective. The dense fur trapped air more efficiently than woven wool. A thick bearskin or several sheep pelts layered together created exceptional insulation. These furs were valuable and were given to family members whose position or age made them most vulnerable to cold. The youngest children and the elderly grandmother received priority for the best furs. The practice of shared warmth extended beyond immediate family members. In longhouses that housed multiple related families or unrelated individuals in service or fosterage, sleeping arrangements might pair unrelated people for warmth. Two young men working as farmhands might share a sleeping area. Fostered children might sleep with the children of the fostering family. The thermal benefits outweighed the potential social awkwardness. Animals in the byre contributed indirectly to the longhouse warmth. Cattle, with their large body mass, generated substantial heat. A single cow at rest produced as much heat as several adult humans. 3 cows in the attached byre section generated considerable warmth that diffused through the partition wall and raised the temperature in the adjacent living area. The humans benefited from this heat without having to share their sleeping areas directly with the animals. The accumulation of heat in the longhouse followed physical laws. Heat flowed from warmer areas to colder areas. The human and animal bodies were the warmest sources. The fire was the other significant source. The heat from these sources diffused through the interior air, was absorbed by surfaces, and was lost through walls, roof, floor, and ventilation openings. The balance between heat generation and heat loss determined the interior temperature. Shared warmth was most effective where people were in direct contact or very close proximity. The heat transfer between touching bodies was much more efficient than heat transfer through air. 2 people sleeping with their backs touching shared heat directly through conduction. This direct sharing was more effective than sleeping even a few centimeters apart. The psychological comfort of shared sleeping was also significant. The presence of other people, the sound of their breathing, the physical warmth of their bodies, all contributed to a sense of security and well-being. This was especially important for children who might otherwise have been frightened by the darkness and cold. Sleeping between parents or siblings provided comfort that helped them rest peacefully. The shared warmth strategy had developed over generations of winter survival. Families learned through experience how to arrange sleeping areas, how many people could effectively share warmth, and how to balance the thermal benefits against the need for personal space and privacy. The knowledge was passed down, taught by example and experience, refined over time. As the night deepened and the coldest hours arrived, the people in the Longhouse relied on this shared warmth. They lay close together under their layers of wool and fur, their bodies generating heat, that heat spreading through the clustered sleepers, creating zones of warmth in the cold building. This was how they survived the winter nights, not as isolated individuals, but as a collective, sharing their metabolic heat, protecting each other through the long cold hours until morning. Midwinter's depth. The year turned, and winter entered its deepest phase. This was not marked by a single day, but by the accumulation of weeks when darkness dominated almost entirely. When cold settled into a persistent, grinding presence, when time itself seemed to stretch and slow, the rhythm of life contracted to its most minimal pattern, maintaining warmth, preparing food, small indoor tasks, and long hours of rest. In the far north, the polar night reached its zenith. The sun remained below the horizon for weeks. In northern Iceland, complete darkness prevailed for much of each day, broken only by a brief period of twilight at what would have been midday. In Greenland's settlements, the darkness was even more profound, the twilight briefer, the sense of isolation more intense. Further south, in coastal Norway, the sun appeared, briefly above the horizon, but only barely. It traced a low arc through the southern sky, never rising far, providing light that was dim and cold. The daylight period lasted only 4 or 5 hours, bookended by long periods of darkness that blended morning and evening into a single extended night. The cold reached its most severe levels. Temperatures that had been merely cold in autumn now dropped to dangerous extremes. Days with temperatures far below freezing became normal. The air had a sharp, painful quality that made breathing through the nose uncomfortable. Exposed skin froze rapidly. The cold penetrated everything, finding its way through layers of insulation, settling into bones and joints. Inside the Longhouse, the internal temperature dropped to its lowest point of the year. The fire burned as it always had, but the battle against cold became harder. More fuel was needed to maintain even the minimal warmth that had sufficed earlier. The family used fuel more freely now, accepting that winter's second half would require careful rationing, but knowing that the deepest cold had to be met with adequate fire. The sleeping benches felt colder. The wood, despite layers of straw and hide, transmitted cold from the frozen air of the Longhouse interior. People woke sometimes with stiff muscles and aching joints, their bodies chilled despite the blankets. Morning movements were slow and painful until circulation improved and warmth returned to extremities. Food stores had diminished noticeably. The household had consumed steadily through autumn and early winter, and now perhaps a third or even half of the original stores were gone. The remaining food represented what must last until spring. Families calculated carefully, measuring out portions, balancing the need for adequate nutrition against the need to make supplies last. The diet had become monotonous. Fresh food was a memory. Meals consisted of dried fish, salted meat, porridge from stored grain, and whatever preserved vegetables remained. The lack of variety was difficult psychologically. People craved tastes and textures they could not have, and the repetitive nature of meals added to the sense of winter's oppression. Physical activity had decreased. With outdoor work impossible and indoor space limited, people moved less. They sat more, walked less, performed fewer physically demanding tasks. This reduced activity meant their bodies required fewer calories, which helped stretch food stores, but it also contributed to a general sense of lethargy and lowered spirits. Sleep dominated the daily rhythm. With darkness prevailing and little to do, people slept longer hours. 10, 12, even 14 hours of sleep per night became common. The body, responding to the extended darkness and cold, produced more melatonin and encouraged rest. Sleep became both a physical necessity and a way to pass time, to make the winter move faster by being less conscious of it. Children became restless. The confinement, lack of outdoor play, the dimness of the Longhouse interior all contributed to their irritability. They quarrelled with siblings over small things, they complained of boredom. Parents and older family members had to manage this restlessness with patience, providing activities and instruction to keep young minds occupied. The The women's textile work continued, but even this task had become somewhat monotonous. The spinning and weaving were necessary, but after months of the same activity, they lost their ability to engage the mind fully. The work proceeded mechanically, hands moving in familiar patterns while thoughts wandered. Men faced similar challenges. Tool maintenance could only occupy so much time. Carving projects eventually reached completion. The long hours of darkness and cold left many hours to fill with little to do. Conversations, stories and games helped, but there were limits to how much these activities could stave off the tedium of confinement. The elderly grandmother withdrew somewhat into herself during this period. The cold affected her more than others. She spent more time sitting close to the fire, wrapped in furs, speaking less than she had earlier in winter. Her age and the strain of the season created a combination that made social interaction more effortful than she could easily manage. Tensions within the household sometimes emerged during this period. The constant proximity, the stress of cold and confinement, the worry about food stores, all created conditions where small irritations could grow into conflicts. A sharp word, an inconsiderate action, a failure to share fairly, these things mattered more when there was no escape, no ability to walk away and create distance. The household head worked to manage these tensions. As the authority figure, he had to mediate disputes, enforce fairness, and maintain the order that kept the household functioning. This was not always easy. His own stress and weariness made patience more difficult. But the responsibility fell to him, and he carried it as best he could. Outside, the world was locked in winter's grip. Snow covered everything, piled in drifts around the Longhouse, blocking paths, burying the landscape. Ice formed thick layers on any exposed water. The fjords and coastline showed ice extending out from shore. Trees, in the few areas where they grew, stood bare and frosted, their branches heavy with accumulated snow. Wildlife was scarce. Most animals had migrated, denned or retreated to sheltered locations. The few that remained visible were those adapted to winter survival. Ravens, Arctic foxes, the occasional glimpse of a seal or deer. Hunting was difficult or impossible. The game was hard to find and the conditions made hunting expeditions dangerous. The household relied entirely on stored food. Night skies, when clear, displayed the aurora borealis. The northern lights danced across the darkness, curtains of green and sometimes pink light moving and shifting in the upper atmosphere. Inside the Longhouse, people sometimes glimpsed these lights through cracks or when briefly outside. The aurora provided a visual wonder, a beautiful phenomenon that broke the monotony of darkness, though it offered no warmth or practical benefit. The household marked time in small ways. Some families kept tallies, marking days on a stick or carving notches to track the passage of winter. Others relied on memory and observation, watching the slow changes in daylight duration or noting the progression of the moon phases. The tracking was imprecise but gave a sense of movement through the season. Psychologically, midwinter was the hardest period. The initial excitement of winter's arrival had long faded. The end seemed far away. The present stretched endlessly, each day similar to the last, each night long and cold. This was the time when spirits flagged, when depression might set in, when the strength of will was most tested. But the household endured. They maintained their routines, they tended the fire, they prepared meals, they told stories, they cared for each other. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, the season began its turn. The days, though still very short, no longer shortened. The worst cold, though intense, would eventually break. Midwinter's depth was not the end. It was the point from which the slow climb towards spring would begin. Small work, long thoughts. The hours of darkness and confinement demanded occupation. Bodies could rest only so much before inactivity became its own form of discomfort. Minds needed engagement to remain alert and healthy. The household filled the long winter days with small tasks, work that could be done indoors with limited light and space, work that produced useful results while keeping hands and minds occupied. Spinning occupied much of the women's time. The process was meditative and endless. Raw wool, cleaned and carded earlier, was transformed into thread through the rhythmic motion of the drop spindle. The spinner held the distaff, a stick holding the prepared wool, in one hand or tucked under an arm. With the other hand, she drew out a small amount of wool and attached it to the spindle. The spindle was a weighted stick. The weight, a circular whirl made of stone or clay, gave the spindle momentum when spun. The spinner released the spindle and it dropped, spinning as it fell. The rotation twisted the drawn-out wool fibres, turning them into thread. When the spindle reached the ground, the spinner stopped its spin, wound the newly created thread onto the spindle shaft, and began the process again. The work required attention, but not intense concentration. After years of practice, the movements became automatic. This allowed the spinner's mind to wander, to engage in conversation, or to listen to stories viewed while the hands continued their work. Hour after hour, day after day, the thread accumulated, slowly building the supply needed for weaving. Weaving was more complex and required more focus. The upright loom stood against one wall, its frame holding the warp threads taut. Stone or clay weights hung from the warp threads, providing the tension needed to keep them straight and even. The weaver stood at the loom, passing the weft thread through the warp, alternating over and under the warp threads to create the interlaced structure of cloth. A weaving sword, a flat wooden blade, helped beat the weft threads tight, creating a dense fabric. The work was slow and rhythmic. A skilled weaver might complete only a few centimetres in a full day of work. But the fabric grew, gradually taking shape, destined to become a garment or blanket that would serve the household for years. The quality of the cloth reflected the skill of the weaver. Even tension, consistent thread density, and careful attention to detail produced fabric that was strong and durable. Errors, missed threads, uneven tension, broken warp threads created weak points or irregular areas that reduced the cloth's value and durability. Men occupied themselves with different work. Wood carving provided both practical results and creative satisfaction. With a knife and a piece of wood, a skilled carver could create spoons, bowls, game pieces, or decorative items. The work was precise, requiring good light and steady hands. Near the fire, where light was best. The carver worked slowly, shaving thin layers of wood, gradually revealing the intended shape. Tool maintenance was ongoing. Knife edges dulled with use and needed resharpening. A whetstone moistened with water or oil provided the abrasive surface. The blade was drawn across the stone at a specific angle. The motion repeated until the edge became sharp again. The work was simple but essential. Sharp tools made other work easier and safer. Broken items required repair. A cracked bowl might be mended with careful work. A split handle could be wrapped with cord or leather to hold it together. Clothing tears needed sewing. The household could not afford to discard items that could be repaired. Everything had value, and maintaining that value through careful repair extended the usefulness of possessions. Rope and core making used scraps of plant fibre or animal sinew. The materials were twisted together to create strong cordage used for countless purposes. Securing items, lashing construction elements, making nets or snares, creating restraints for animals. The work could be done with cold, stiff fingers and required no special light, making it suitable for evening hours or the dimmest days. Leather work occupied some time. Hides that had been prepared earlier might need additional treatment. Soft leather could be worked with tools to make it more supple. Decorative tooling could be added to create patterns. Leather strips could be cut for lacing or ties. The work smelled strongly of the leather, and the oils used in tanning, adding to the complex scent profile of the Longhouse interior. Children learned through participation in these tasks. A young girl might hold the distaff for her mother while the mother spun. A boy might watch his father carve, eventually being given a piece of wood and a dull knife to practice with. The learning was hands-on, immediate and practical. Skills were transferred through demonstration and supervised practice, generation to generation. The elderly grandmother, despite her age, contributed to the household work. Her eyesight was not what it had been, limiting her ability to do fine detail work. But she could still spin thread with her experienced hands, the motion so ingrained after decades of practice that she could do it almost by feel. Her presence and her work, even if slower than in her youth, added to the household's productivity and gave her a sense of purpose and value. Stories filled the mental space while hands worked. The adults told stories they had heard from their own elders. Tales of gods and heroes, of ancestors and their deeds, of the land before settlement, of great voyages and brave warriors. The children listened, absorbing the cultural knowledge embedded in these narratives, learning the values and history of their people. Some stories were educational in subtle ways. A tale about a hunter who ignored warnings and perished in a storm taught the importance of heeding wisdom. A story about a clever woman who solved a difficult problem demonstrated the value of intelligence and creativity. The lessons were not stated explicitly, but emerged naturally from the narratives. Riddles provided entertainment and mental exercise. What has roots nobody sees, is taller than trees, up it goes, and yet never grows? The answer, a mountain, seemed obvious once revealed, but required thought to discern. Riddles ranged from simple to complex, engaging different age groups and skill levels. Memory games tested and improved recall. One person might list a series of items. The next person had to repeat the list and add another item. The list grew until someone failed to remember it correctly. This game was simple but engaging, and it served the practical purpose of training memory, essential in a culture that relied heavily on oral transmission of knowledge. Singing occasionally broke the quiet. Traditional songs, passed down through generations, filled the Longhouse with music. The songs told stories, celebrated events, or simply created beauty through melody and rhythm. Singing together was a communal activity that lifted spirits and created a shared emotional experience. Physical games adapted to the limited space included things like finger wrestling or tests of balance and coordination that could be done while seated. These small competitions provided amusement and allowed people, especially children, to expend some physical energy without requiring extensive movement. The long thoughts that accompanied small work were as important as the work itself. Hours of repetitive handwork freed the mind to wander, to reflect, to imagine. People thought about the past winter, comparing it to previous winters. They thought about the coming spring and what it would bring. They planned for future seasons, considering what they might do differently. Some thoughts turned to philosophy and the larger questions of existence. What was the purpose of life? What happened after death? What pleased the gods and what angered them? These were not idle questions, but serious considerations that shaped how people understood their world and their place in it. The darkness and confinement of winter created unusual mental states for some. Extended periods indoors with limited sensory stimulation could lead to vivid dreams, unusual thoughts, or heightened imagination. Some people reported visions or experiences that seemed to blur the line between waking and sleeping. These experiences were sometimes interpreted as communications from the spirit world or as glimpses of hidden realities. The small work continued day after day, week after week. The thread accumulated, the cloth grew on the loom, the carved objects took shape, the repaired items returned to service, and the long thoughts flowed through minds freed from immediate demands, thinking, remembering, imagining, dreaming, passing the time until winter released its hold and spring allowed them to emerge back into the world beyond the Longhouse walls. When fire dimmed. Each evening, as the household prepared for sleep, the fire underwent its transformation from active flame to banked coals. This transition was a practiced ritual, performed with attention and care, because the success of fire preservation through the night would determine the ease of the morning and could, in extreme cold, affect survival itself. The process began after the evening meal, when the last cooking tasks were complete. The fire had been burning steadily through the late afternoon and evening, providing heat for cooking and warmth for the family's activities. Now, as sleep approached, the goal changed from maximum heat output to fuel preservation and coal survival. The firekeeper, usually one of the women of the household, managed this transition. She allowed the flames to burn down naturally, not adding new fuel once the cooking was finished. The fire's intensity decreased as the existing fuel was consumed. Large flames gave way to smaller ones. Eventually, only glowing coals remained, red and hot, radiating heat but producing no visible flame. These coals were the key to tomorrow's fire. If they could be preserved through the night, the morning fire could be restarted quickly by simply exposing them to air and adding fuel. If they died, restarting the fire would require the full fire-starting process, striking sparks, catching them in tinder, nursing them into flame, a task that was more difficult in the cold morning air. The banking process involved covering the coals with ash, The ash was readily available, accumulated from previous fires and stored near the hearth. The firekeeper used a wooden tool to scoop ash from its storage location and carefully spread it over the glowing coals, creating a layer several centimetres thick. The ash served a specific purpose. It reduced the amount of oxygen reaching the coals. Fire requires oxygen to burn, and limiting oxygen slowed the combustion process dramatically. The coals beneath the ash continued to burn, but very slowly, consuming their remaining fuel over many hours rather than burning brightly and quickly exhausting themselves. The thickness of the ash layer had to be precisely judged. Too little ash, and the coals would continue to burn too quickly, consuming themselves before morning. Too much ash, and the coals would be completely smothered, dying from lack of oxygen. Experience taught the right balance, and skilled firekeepers could gauge by eye and feel how much ash to apply. The shape of the ash covering also mattered. It was mounded over the coals, creating a dome or smooth pile. This shape protected the coals while allowing some minimal air circulation at the edges. The mound was compact but not compressed, maintaining a structure that balanced protection with the small amount of oxygen the coals needed to survive. Once the ash was properly applied, the banked fire was left undisturbed. Any attempts to check on it or adjust it would disturb the carefully created environment and potentially extinguish the coals. The household trusted the process and went to sleep, knowing that beneath the grey ash the red coals glowed faintly, marking time through the cold night. The banked fire produced minimal heat. The thick ash layer insulated the coals, preventing their heat from radiating effectively into the room. The temperature near the hearth dropped significantly compared to evening levels. The household felt this cooling as they settled to sleep, the familiar warmth of the active fire giving way to the reality of night's chill. This cooling was accepted as necessary. The alternative, maintaining a strong fire through the night, would have consumed fuel at an unsustainable rate. The household's fuel stores had to last until spring, and this required rationing their use. The banked fire represented the compromise between the need for warmth and the need to conserve resources. In especially cold weather, some households added one innovation to the banking process. They sometimes placed a large stone or several stones in the fire during the evening, allowing them to absorb heat. When the fire was banked, these hot stones continued to radiate warmth for several hours, providing more heat to the sleeping area than the banked coals alone could offer. This technique required stones that could withstand heating without cracking. River stones were avoided because they might contain water that would expand explosively when heated. The psychological effect of banking the fire was subtle but real. The active fire represented life, warmth, and security. When it was reduced to hidden coals, the Longhouse felt more vulnerable. The darkness deepened. The cold advanced. The night became more pressing. These feelings were mostly unconscious, but they contributed to the sense of unease that accompanied deep winter nights. Children sometimes found the dimming of the fire distressing when they were very young. The flames had provided visual stimulation and comfort. Their absence left the interior much darker, with only faint red glows visible through cracks in the ash layer. Parents reassured children that the fire still lived, that it would return in the morning, that the darkness was temporary and safe. The transition from fire to sleep happened gradually. People did not lie down immediately when the fire was banked. They remained awake for a time in the dimness, talking quietly, finishing small tasks, allowing their eyes to adjust and their minds to transition toward rest. The gradual dimming and the quiet conversations helped ease the shift from wakefulness to sleep. Some nights, particularly in the deepest part of winter, the banked fire seemed barely adequate. The cold was so intense that people questioned whether the coals would survive, whether the fuel savings were worth the discomfort. But tradition and experience held firm. The banked fire was how winters were survived, how fuel stores lasted, how mornings began with fire rather than with the difficult work of starting anew. The trust required to bank the fire and sleep through the cold night was a learned trust. It came from experience, from having done this before and knowing that morning would come, that the coals would survive, that the fire would return. For children experiencing winter for the first time, this trust had to be taught. They learned by watching, by experiencing, by seeing that their parents' confidence was justified. As sleep claimed the household, the banked fire continued its slow burn beneath the ash. The coals consumed themselves, molecular by molecular, their energy released as a heat that could not escape, trapped by the insulating layer above. The process was chemical and inevitable, carbon combining with oxygen, creating carbon dioxide and heat, the fundamental process of fire proceeding at a drastically slowed pace. Outside, the night was darker and colder than the dim interior. The banked fire's small warmth, the layered bodies on the sleeping benches, the wool and fur and turf, all combined to create a space where life persisted through conditions that would otherwise be lethal. The fire dimmed but did not die. The people slept but did not freeze. And the long night proceeded hour by hour toward the eventual morning when the ash would be pulled back, the coals exposed to air, and the fire brought back to life. The turn toward light. The change was imperceptible at first, measured in minutes added to the day, small enough that no single day showed obvious difference from the one before. But the turning point had passed. The days had stopped shortening. They held steady for a time, and then gradually they began to lengthen. The slow wheel of the seasons had reached its lowest point and begun its rise back toward light. In the Longhouse, this change was not immediately obvious. The interior remained dark, the daily routines continued unchanged. But outside, careful observers noticed the difference. The twilight period at midday lasted slightly longer. The darkness arrived marginally later in the evening. The sun, in places where it briefly appeared, traced a fractionally higher arc across the southern sky. For people who had lived through many winters, these small signs carried great psychological weight. The turning toward light meant that winter, though still firmly in control, had begun its slow retreat. The worst would pass. Spring would eventually come. The knowledge provided hope that helped carry people through the remaining cold weeks. The household still had months of winter ahead. The cold would remain severe for some time. Food stores would continue to diminish. The confinement would persist. But the turning point marked a subtle shift in mood. Conversations began to include more references to spring, to the work that would be done when warmth returned, to plans for the coming year. The lengthening days affected sleep patterns slightly. Bodies, sensitive to light even when that light was minimal, began to adjust. Sleep duration decreased marginally. People woke slightly earlier, their internal rhythms responding to the changing light conditions outside the thick walls. The changes were small, but over weeks they accumulated into noticeable shifts in daily routine. Children were particularly sensitive to these changes. Their bodies and minds, flexible and responsive, adapted quickly to the increasing light. They became slightly more energetic, slightly less subdued. Their play took on a different quality, less lethargic, more animated. Parents noticed and adjusted their management of the children accordingly, finding ways to channel this renewed energy constructively. The turn toward light also marked the beginning of preparations for spring. These preparations were mental and organisational rather than physical. The household head began thinking about what work would need to be done first when weather permitted. Fields to be prepared, animals to be moved to pasture, repairs to be made, tools to be readied. The planning helped structure thinking and provided focus for thoughts that had been circling through the monotony of midwinter. Women began assessing what textile work remained to be completed before spring's busy season began. The weaving that had proceeded through winter would need to be finished. Remaining wool would need to be spun. The transition from winter's indoor focus to spring's outdoor demands required finishing indoor projects so they would not burden the busier season. Food stores were evaluated with new attention. How much remained? How quickly was the household consuming it? Would supplies last until fresh food became available? These calculations had been ongoing, but now they took on urgency. The household was on the backside of winter, and the supplies had to stretch to spring's return. The animals in the buyer section began showing subtle signs of the seasonal change. Their behaviour shifted slightly, becoming more restless. They sensed something in the world outside, some change in light or temperature, or the quality of air. The humans tending them noticed and adjusted care routines to account for this restlessness. Weather patterns began their slow shift. The deepest cold started to give way to somewhat milder temperatures, though the change was gradual and irregular. Some days were still bitterly cold, others were merely cold rather than severe. The ice that had been solid for months occasionally showed signs of weakening, though it would not break for many more weeks. Snow conditions changed. The snow that had fallen in early winter had been light and fluffy. By now it had compacted under its own weight and through repeated freeze-thaw cycles. The surface developed a crust in some places, able to support weight that would have broken through softer snow. This change affected how people moved outside when they had to venture out for essential tasks. The quality of light during the brief daylight hours changed. The sun, climbing slightly higher, produced light that was less red and more white. The angle of illumination created different shadows, shorter and less elongated than the extreme shadows of midwinter. These small changes in light quality affected the appearance of the landscape and contributed to the sense that the season was shifting. Inside the Longhouse, these external changes were felt indirectly. The physical space remained the same. The daily activities continued largely unchanged. But the psychological atmosphere shifted. Hope, which had been carefully maintained through midwinter's depths, now had tangible support. The turn toward light was real, measurable, undeniable. Spring would come. This knowledge did not eliminate the challenges of the remaining winter. The cold still had to be endured, the food still had to be rationed, the confinement still had to be managed. But the burden felt lighter. The end, though still distant, was now visible on the horizon. The family that had contracted into itself during midwinter's darkness began, very gradually, to look outward again. Thaw and Emergence. The transition from winter to spring in the Viking North was not a sudden event. It was a gradual process that folded over weeks, marked by advancing and retreating forces, by cold snaps following warm days, by the slow, uneven melting of snow and ice that had dominated the landscape for months. The first signs appeared in subtle changes. Water that had been frozen solid for the entire winter began showing cracks. Ice on smaller streams thinned and became unsafe to walk on. Snow on south-facing slopes started melting during the midday hours, though it refroze at night, creating crusty surfaces by morning. Temperatures rose gradually. Days that reached just above freezing became more common. These warmer days, while still cold by summer standards, felt dramatically different after months of sustained cold. The air lost some of its sharp, painful quality. Breathing became easier. The sun, when it appeared, provided not just light but a perceptible warmth. The Longhouse interior responded to these changes. The temperature inside, which had been barely above freezing for much of winter, began to rise slightly. The cold that had seemed permanent now fluctuated with daily cycles. Midday felt warmer than it had in months. The difference was small, perhaps only a few degrees, but after months of constant cold it was noticeable and welcome. Snow began its retreat from the landscape. The process was slow and irregular. South-facing slopes lost their snow cover first. North-facing slopes retained snow for weeks longer. The land emerged gradually, revealing ground that had been hidden since autumn. The revealed earth was frozen hard, but it was as earth, no longer buried under meters of snow. Runoff from melting snow created streams and rivulets that had not existed in winter. Water flowed downhill, following the contours of the land, pooling in low areas, eventually finding its way to larger streams and the sea. The sound of running water returned to the landscape, a sound that had been absent for months, replaced by the silence of frozen stillness. The increase in available light was dramatic. Days that had been measured in a few hours now extended to 8, 10, 12 hours of daylight. The extended light transformed daily life. Work that had been constrained by darkness could now be done with ease. The psychological impact was profound. The darkness that had oppressed spirits for months was lifting. Birds returned, harbingers of spring. Migratory species that had fled south in autumn now came back north to their breeding grounds. Their arrival was noted and celebrated. The sight of birds in flight, the sound of their calls represented life returning to the land. The birds also represented food. Eggs would soon be available, a fresh food source after months of preserved provisions. The Longhouse needed maintenance after the winter's strain. Snow melting from the roof sometimes revealed places where the turf had thinned or where the structure had shifted. These areas required repair. The household head and the other men of the family ventured out on the milder days to assess damage and begin necessary work. The turf roof, heavy with accumulated snow and saturated with meltwater, sometimes sagged or leaked. Weak spots had to be reinforced. Additional turf had to be cut and placed where existing covering had failed. The work was cold and difficult, but it was necessary. A roof that survived winter in weakened condition might not survive the next winter without repairs. The animals emerged from the byre section. On mild days, they were led outside for the first time in months. Their initial steps were uncertain. They had been confined for so long that open space seemed strange. But they quickly remembered freedom and began to move more naturally, eager for any green growth that might have emerged. The household's activities shifted from entirely indoor to partially outdoor. Tasks that had been impossible in deep winter now became feasible. Fuel collection could resume, adding to stores depleted by winter use. Fishing became possible again as ice broke up along the coast. Hunting resumed, targeting animals that were also emerging from their winter retreats. The family began sorting through stored items, assessing what had survived winter and what had been lost to damage or consumption. Some items had deteriorated. Leather had dried and cracked. Fabric had developed mildew in the damp interior. Metal tools had rusted slightly. Each damaged item was evaluated. Could it be repaired or must it be replaced? Food stores were nearly depleted. What remained was often the least desirable items, the food that had been saved for last because it was less palatable or nutritious. But fresh food was beginning to become available. Early greens emerged from the ground in sheltered locations. Birds' eggs could be collected. Fish were running. The diet began to diversify after months of monotony. The physical condition of the household members showed the effects of winter. Bodies were thinner, having burned through fat reserves. Skin was hale from months without sunlight. Muscles had weakened from reduced activity. Some people showed signs of nutritional deficiencies, bleeding gums from inadequate vitamin C, poor wound healing, fatigue beyond what sleep should cause. But the human body is resilient. With increasing food availability and renewed exposure to sunlight, these deficiencies would be corrected. Strength would return, colour would return to skin. The lethargy of late winter would give way to the renewed energy of spring. The emergence from the Longhouse paralleled a bodily emergence from winter's effects. The emotional atmosphere in the household changed markedly. The depression and tension of late winter gave way to relief and anticipation. People smiled more. Conversations were more animated. Children played with greater energy. The burden of confinement, while not yet completely lifted, had lightened substantially. Plans for the coming season became concrete. The farmer laid out the work schedule, which fields would be planted first, which tasks had priority, how labour would be divided. The family would soon shift from winter's indoor survival mode to summer's outdoor productivity mode. The transition required preparation and organisation. Cleaning the Longhouse became a priority. Months of occupation had created accumulated dirt, debris, and odours that needed to be addressed. On warm days, doors and windows were opened to air out the interior. Straw was removed from the floor and replaced with fresh material. Stored items were reorganised. The space was prepared for its summer role, which would be less intensive than its winter function. The emergence was not complete. Cold snaps still occurred, driving people back indoors. Snow still fell occasionally. Winter had not surrendered completely, but its power was broken. The long siege of cold and darkness was ending. The household had survived. They had endured the months when the world outside was hostile to human life, when survival depended on the shelter they had built and the preparations they had made. And now, slowly, they were emerging back into a world that would once again support active, outdoor life. What winter taught. The winter that had seemed endless eventually passed, as winters always did. The people who had entered the season in autumn emerged in spring, changed by the experience but intact, having survived the test that came every year, that their ancestors had survived for generations, that defined life in the Viking North. What winter taught was not dramatic or sudden. The lessons emerged gradually, absorbed through experience rather than explicit instruction. Children learned by living through the season, by observing how adults managed the challenges, by participating in the work and routines that made survival possible. They learned about preparation, about the critical importance of autumn work. The difference between adequate and inadequate preparation could mean the difference between comfort and misery, or even between life and death. The food stores that ran out too soon, the fuel that did not last, the clothing that proved insufficient. These failures taught lessons that would not be forgotten. They learned about community and cooperation. No individual survived winter alone in the Longhouse. The family functioned as a unit, each member contributing it according to their ability, each depending on the others. The shared warmth, the shared resources, the shared labour, all demonstrated that survival was collective, not individual. They learned about patience and endurance. Winter could not be rushed or fought directly. It had to be waited out, its slow passage endured with patience. The ability to accept confinement, to tolerate monotony, to remain stable through months of darkness and cold, these were essential skills for northern life. They learned about the relationship between humans and their environment. The Longhouse showed how architecture could create secure-movable space in hostile conditions. The layering of materials, the trapping of air, the careful management of heat, all demonstrated sophisticated understanding of thermal principles, understanding that had developed through generations of experience. They learned about fire, about its central importance to human survival in cold climates. The skills of fire starting, fire tending, and fire preservation were not optional luxuries. They were essential knowledge. A family without these skills would not survive winter. The continuity of the fire through the season represented the continuity of life itself. They learned about textile production and its crucial role. The wool and linen that clothed and covered them did not simply appear. It was created through months of labour, through the endless work of spinning and weaving. The cloth represented accumulated human effort, time transformed into material that preserved warmth and protected life. They learned about resource management, about rationing and conservation. The food and fuel that seemed abundant in autumn dwindled through winter. Making supplies last required careful calculation and disciplined consumption. The lesson was clear. Resources are finite, and their use must be managed with foresight and restraint. They learned about hierarchy and social order. The sleeping arrangements, the distribution of resources, the assignment of tasks, all reflected the social structure that organised the household. This structure was not arbitrary. It had practical functions in survival, ensuring that the most capable managed essential tasks and that the most vulnerable received necessary protection. They learned about resilience and adaptation. Bodies adapted to cold, to darkness, to reduced nutrition, minds adapted to confinement and monotony. The human capacity to adjust to challenging conditions, while not unlimited, was substantial. People could endure more than they might have thought possible. They learned about the rhythms of nature, about the cycles of light and dark, warmth and cold, growth and dormancy. Winter was not an aberration, but a regular part of the annual cycle. Life in the north meant accepting and adapting to these cycles, shaping human activity to match the seasons rather than attempting to resist them. They learned about the value of knowledge, of the information passed down through generations, the techniques for building longhouses, for banking fires, for processing wool, for preserving food, all represented accumulated wisdom. This knowledge was the foundation of survival, and its transmission from old to young was essential for cultural continuity. They learned about storytelling and cultural memory. The stories told during long winter evenings carried more than entertainment. They held history, values, practical knowledge, and cultural identity. The oral tradition preserved what needed to be preserved when writing was limited or absent. They learned about the limits of individual strength and the necessity of interdependence. The strongest adult could not survive winter alone. The most skilled craftsperson still needed the work of others. Everyone depended on the collective capabilities of the household, and the household depended on every member's contribution. The Longhouse itself embodied many of these lessons. It was not a sophisticated structure by later standards. It had no complex mechanisms, no advanced technologies, but it worked. It provided the essential function of creating survivable space through winter. The design reflected generations of refinement, each element serving a purpose, the whole greater than the sum of its parts. The season's passage left its marks. Some people did not survive winter. Illness, injury, or the accumulated strain, cold and inadequate nutrition claimed lives. The elderly were particularly vulnerable. Infants and young children faced risks. Each loss was felt by the household and the wider community, a reminder of winter's dangers, but most survived. And survival itself was an achievement. The people who emerged in spring had proven themselves capable of enduring what their environment demanded. They carried forward the knowledge they had reinforced through another winter's experience. and they prepared as they always did for the cycle to begin again. The winter had been survived not through fighting against nature, but through working with it. The longhouse, the fire, the clothing, the social organisation, all represented accommodation to winter's realities. Vikings did not conquer winter. They adapted to it, creating systems and practices that allowed human life to persist through conditions that would otherwise exclude it. As spring advanced and outdoor life resumed, the memory of winter began to fade. The cold became a memory rather than a present reality. The darkness gave way to long days of light. The confinement ended as work took people out into fields and forests. But the lessons remained, embedded in practice and tradition, ready to guide the household when autumn returned and the preparation for another winter began. The cycle would continue. Next autumn would bring the same preparations, the same retreat indoors, the same long months of darkness and cold. And the household would face it with the knowledge gained from this winter and all the winters before. They would gather food, collect fuel, repair buildings, spin wool, and prepare themselves mentally for what was coming. Because this was life in the Viking North. This was how winter was survived. Through architecture, community, preparation, and the accumulated wisdom of generations who had faced the same challenge and found ways to endure. As this long winter finally releases its grip, we're left with an understanding of survival that goes beyond individual strength. The Longhouse stood not just as shelter, but as a statement about human adaptation, showing how people could create warmth and rest in a world that seemed designed to prevent both. The Vikings who slept through these winters did so because they understood layering. Layers of turf and wood, layers of wool and fur, layers of family warmth and community knowledge. Every element worked together. The building held heat that the fire created, the fire that the stored fuel fed, the fuel that the autumn labour provided, the labour that the knowledge of ancestors guided. Sleep in the Viking longhouse was not the comfortable rest we know today. It was sleep earned through preparation, made possible by architecture, and sustained by the presence of others. It was cold sleep by our standards, but it was enough. Through the darkest months, through temperatures that would kill in hours, families found rest on their wooden benches, wrapped in wool and fur, trusting the walls around them and the warmth between them. The story of how they managed this, how they built, how they insulated, how they arranged themselves, how they waited through the darkness, is a story of ingenuity meeting necessity. It's a reminder that comfort is not always required for survival, but that preparation, understanding and community almost always are. Winter taught these northern families what all harsh seasons teach, that survival comes from working with nature rather than against it, from shared effort rather than isolated struggle, from patience rather than force. The cold could not be defeated, but it could be endured. The darkness could not be banished, but shelter could be found within it. As you drift toward your own rest now, in warmth and safety, perhaps carry with you the image of those winter sleepers, the banked coals glowing beneath ash, the breath of families mingling in cold air, the sound of wind against turf walls, the patient wait for spring. Their sleep was different from yours, harder and colder, but it served the same essential purpose: renewal, rest, and the gathering of strength for what tomorrow would bring. The Longhouse stands in memory as proof that humans can find rest even in the coldest places, that winter can be survived, and that sleep, however hard won, eventually comes to those who prepare, endure, and wait together through the long dark nights.